You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So Glenn, we've got some major news here. The Michigan Supreme Court ruled that Trump could in fact appear on the ballot in that state. But this isn't a total win for Trump, so can you explain why?
You know, it's not a total win because the only thing that really comes from this Michigan Supreme Court ruling is that the Republican Party, for better or worse, in Michigan has the right to put anybody on the Republican primary ballot that they want, including a 15-year-old, even though we know that you have to be 35 to be qualified to be president. They could put somebody who's not a natural-born citizen on their primary ballot, and they can put an insurrectionist on the ballot, which is precisely what they did. They put Donald Trump on the ballot. And here's the thing. Under the election laws of Michigan, the Secretary of State has absolutely no authority. She has no say in who the Republican Party in Michigan puts on the primary ballot. And that is why the Michigan Supreme Court said this issue is basically not ripe to be decided by us. People might not know there is a doctrine in the law called ripeness. Legal issues, just like fruit, have to be ripe before you're going to eat the fruit or before a court will take up the issue. So this may feel like a win. It may sound like a win. It might make us, furious that an insurrectionist gets to be on a primary ballot. But every single state has its own election laws, and they promulgate their own election regulations. Michigan's, could probably be reworked a little because it doesn't make a lot of sense putting somebody on a primary ballot who is otherwise disqualified from serving in office. So, but, this is what we are stuck with at the moment. So, this may represent Trump winning a very minor battle, but he has not yet won the war of being on the presidential ballot in Michigan.
Well, will this Michigan decision have any impact on the U.S. Supreme Court's eventual ruling on this question, even if just atmospheric?
I think that's a great question. Atmospherically, everything matters, right? It matters in the court of public opinion, in the public square, but I do think the courts pay attention to what's going on, on the ballot battlefront in each of the 50 states. At the end of the day, though, the Supreme Court in Michigan saying, we're not going to take this issue up because it's not yet ripe, really will ultimately, in the long run, have no effect on how the Supreme Court might handle this issue.
Glenn, do you think that having such scattershot rulings on the same issue, like this issue was resolved one way in Colorado, another way in a narrow sense. In Michigan, we have other rulings coming up in Oregon and other states on the same question. Will this increase the likelihood that the U.S. Supreme Court will have to weigh in, like the fact that one state says yes and another state says no?
Yeah, another great question. There's so much to unpack here. I feel like we should do a legal breakdown law school class when we have the time. But there are a couple of things at play, and some of them compete with one another. There's some friction, so stick with me here. You've got the idea of federalism, right? The federal government and the federal courts are the ones that will interpret what the federal Constitution says. However, you also have states' rights. And each of the 50 states is its own sovereign. They have every right to pass their own election laws, to promulgate their own election regulations. And the federal government doesn't control that, and the Supreme Court doesn't control that. But, so here is where I think the friction comes in. When these cases, we don't know which one will be the first disqualification case that makes its way up to the Supreme Court. It might be the one out of Colorado, which was just recently appealed after the Colorado Supreme Court said, yep, in Colorado, under our laws and procedures, Donald Trump is disqualified from being on the ballot. That may be the first one to get up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will be the last stop for interpreting what the federal Constitution says and what it means. So they will be the ones to decide. If the 14th Amendment, Section 3, allows a president who engaged in insurrection to continue to serve in public office. Now, that would take us one step in the direction of being a banana republic, but the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, will be the last stop to make that determination. However, Brian, all 50 states will apply their own laws and their own regulations and their own procedures, and they will get to decide whether anything in their state constitution or their state election laws disqualifies Donald Trump. But in the end, there's something called the supremacy clause, and I have a feeling if I had to place my $1 bet, that's my maximum bet. I'm not a high roller. I will bet that the Supreme Court, if they announce that for whatever reason, the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to disqualify Donald Trump, even if he engaged in insurrection, I think the supremacy clause will win the day. And I think all 50 states will ultimately feel like they have to fall in line and they won't be able to disqualify Donald Trump, even if under the laws of their state, there's an argument that he should be disqualified. Of course, all of this is us looking into the magic 8 ball, right, and trying to predict, based on what we know, exactly what the Supreme Court will end up doing.
Now, is there any notice that we're going to get a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court? Like, are we going to see arguments in front of the justices, or, will the decision just come one day with no warning?
I have a feeling we're going to get some notice on this one. I think what will happen is we'll probably hear the Supreme Court has accepted for review one case or another. Again, I would lay my $1 bet on the Colorado Supreme Court case. And then they will probably very quickly set it for oral argument, like within a week or two, because everybody acknowledges time is of the essence here with the election coming up in 2024. And then I have a feeling you'll get a ruling from the Supreme Court pretty promptly after the oral arguments. There's one thing that happens every once in a while when time is really of the essence. A case will be argued and the appellate court will say, we are hereby ruling as follows on this argument with a full opinion to follow. That signals to everybody how they're deciding the issue, but they will take some time to put together what is often a very lengthy analysis and written opinion. I have a feeling, though, we're going to know about this in advance, and it's going to be decided quickly.
And let's finish off with this. A lot of the pushback here is that by virtue of the Colorado Supreme Court ruling that Donald Trump is disqualified from the ballot, that this is election interference by Democrats. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, I get so tired of Donald Trump and his lackey lawyers trying to convince us that, day is night and wrong is right. It's not. Take this to the bank, Brian. If an insurrectionist is permitted to have his name placed on a presidential ballot in a general election, that will involve actual election interference. Donald Trump and his lawyers are trying to persuade us of the exact opposite, that somebody should be permitted to engage in insurrection against the United States, try to overthrow the existing government, try to thwart the expressed will of the American voters, and that person should still be permitted to serve as president. That's election interference. Why? Because you're taking somebody that the Constitution disqualifies, and you're ignoring the constitutional disqualification, and you're trying to cram that person down the throats of the American people as a legitimate and viable candidate for federal office. That's election interference.
Well, you know what they say, every accusation is a confession. So if there's one thing Trump and the Republicans are good at, it is projection. So with that said, we're on Supreme Court watch right now. As soon as we get any decision here with regard to the appeal from the Colorado Supreme Court regarding Trump's eligibility to be on the ballot in 2024, we'll bring it to you. So if you're not yet subscribed, please make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.